Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the City Council Budget and Finance Committee meeting for Thursday, February 16, 2023. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and we have a couple of items on the agenda. Oh, I'm sorry. Do I hear a motion for adoption of the agenda?
I move to adopt the agenda.
Second. Uncharted territory here. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All right. The ayes have it. Thank you. Councilman Riddle will be a few minutes late. So right now we're a committee of two, but we have a quorum. So with that, our friend Director Vaughn has the director's report to start with. So where are you?
Oh, yes. And so thank you for putting that up on the shared screen. I'm hoping we can maybe move that bigger. Do, yes. And I'll make sure that it goes out to everybody. Email out in addition to it will get attached to the packet. So they're the same, they're just one's a little bigger to actually read.
That's great.
One's a little more forgiving on the eyes.
Yeah, thank you.
So to go over the departments, we're going to start with the operating departments. Gosh, it's been a little while since we've gone over one of these with all of the budget stuff.
Oh, no.
So yeah, it seems like a while. So but it's the same story we've really been talking about for a while now. Detention and jail, that is tending to, the cost is significantly going up right now. We're seeing invoices that are significantly larger than we have seen in the past, and that started just this year. And that trend is continuing. So that is definitely something we are keeping an eye on. And I have been talking to the judge and the chief about that to see if there have been some changes too, in addition, on where we can send our long-term I don't know which
Detainees.
Inmates.
And
So previously we have been able to send them to Eastern Washington, and just recently have lost the ability to do that, which will change the cost. And so more to come on that. It's something we're definitely aware of and keeping an eye on. So and then going down to legal, in the last 2 years, actually since I've been here, so the last 3 years, legal, we have been kind of exceeding that budget line item. And I'll just simply say there has been, it's just all over the board on why. It's all over the board. We've had the CARES, we've had the ARPA funds, we've had lots of contracts, we've had Sound Transit, we've had there's just been a bunch of different reasons why legal has exceeded on cost. And so, but even though these two line items have exceeded, I do just want to say in general, I want to point out that over the last 2 years that every single department has stayed within its budget. And I will say that it caught my attention right away that police was at 100%, but still green. And they, if you flip over and look at the actual numbers on the backside, they're just such a large budget, but everybody has stayed within their allocations that they have been given. And I think that in itself deserves a really big recognition on not just general fund, because there's other things in here, the sewer, the streets, the surface water, and so just those are items of note. The detention and jail, unfortunately, that one and legals, those are kind of two that are a little bit out of our somewhat control. So, then welcome. Walking.
Just for the record, for the people who may be watching this later, in the room are Vice Chair Cassover, Councilmember Goldman, Councilmember Bertani, who are not on camera. So just it's not members of the committee that are attending.
So then I'm just gonna say, walking down to the on the dashboard, the non-operating departments, the audit was at 53%. The city's still navigating a past audit that hopefully we will be able to close out here very shortly in the near future, and then possibly we'll be starting the next year's audits. Community programs, that one is at 84%. And so within elections was 113%, slightly over what we budgeted, but still some of that is within our control and some of it is pretty much not within our control. So we do the best with our knowledge, and we were a little bit low on that estimate going into this budget. Emergency management, that's 146. Some of that is the response to some of the changes that we had made during the COVID pandemic or during the pandemic. So memberships, 91%. So pretty close on the mark on that one. And then public health just slightly over, but that one's a pretty minimal amount there. So walking over to the revenue by fund, the ARPA fiscal recovery fund is at 200% because we adopted the budget at the first half instead of both sides of the two distributions, waiting for the second distribution. That's the reason it's at a 200% mark. But we were waiting to make sure that second distribution came in, and of course it did last June. So that's why that's at 200%. Capital improvement fund, that's at 119. That's a mainly driven real estate excise tax fund. General fund is over the mark. Sewer utility slightly under, but not concerning. On the street fund revenue, slightly under. Some of the right-of-ways and some of the other items were just slightly under. But not in an alarming amount. Surface water utility, again, kind of slightly under. Transportation capital, that one's at 51%. Again, a real estate excise tax REIT 2 fund, but there was a lot of grant revenue built into that fund that we did not see within this, but therefore that's also tied to expenses that weren't expended. So there were some projects that were within that we just, that's the reason on that, is mainly it was grant funded.
Director Vaughn, can we pause just for a
Absolutely.
second and check and see if there are any questions? Colleagues, any thoughts about operating departments, non-operating departments and revenues by fund before we move on to capital?
No. I'm good, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So then going down, I'm gonna actually just stay on the front because I think visually, if we can scroll down, just stay there for those possibly that are viewing. So Animal Acres, the picnic shelter, that just slightly came over into that's was a done deal in 2021. The Beach Drive lift station, that's been put on hold due to some of the previous conversations we had throughout the budget about the bigger concepts that we discussed previously. So the culvert L90 design, that's trucking along. L60, that's done. The construction on L90, that is one that the city, the asterisk there was grant funded, and we have not been successful at up to date securing a funding source for that project. Going into facility projects, that is ended up a little definitely lower than what we anticipated, but some of that is a good thing because some of the expenses that we expected to expend this year didn't need to be expended due to some of the building maintenance, etc. So, and then going on to some of the other Hillside Creek, that just didn't happen. Material bin covers, that we've discussed that, and that is happening in the next budget. We're just going to move on quickly. Parks yeah, Parks Department, that's in our budget. If anybody wants to revisit that conversation, there's plenty of that in the past videos in the 23-24 budget. We'll just leave it at that. Park development, that was a small amount that we just didn't expend. Pedestrian crossing, small amount, and then the Safe Streets early action, that was a small budget relative, and we have actually actively, continually, I should say, been working with a traffic engineer through. And so it's slowly expanding that and doing some improvements around the city. So
Just one moment.
absolutely,
Colleagues, any questions on capital? Please.
Just a quick question about the facilities projects. It sounds like we were able to do maintenance rather than diving into bigger projects. Is the anticipation of those projects have been deferred?
the anticipation was they were budgeted with the amount to replace, and when they were maintained, the answer was they did not need to be replaced at this time.
Okay.
So, I mean, probably with expert reasoning have been deferred, but because it didn't need to be, like, our HVAC didn't need to be replaced, correct? And I'm looking to Director Perigo to verify that I'm not speaking out of turn.
Okay, but generally speaking, they're projects that will eventually
Yes,
find their way into needing to happen. It's just we were able to make do successfully this year. Okay.
which
Gotcha.
means we've maintain that piece of the building in a way that is lasting us a little longer than we expected its life expectancy to go.
Thank you very much.
Mr.
Director.
Rico. Question.
Thank you. So this represents on the capital side, basically it's cash flow, how much money we budgeted, how much money we spent. Are you gonna later in the quarter have a presentation on the status of the capital projects with regard to our program that gives us a status of where we are with the capital program?
I am,
Meaning schedule, budget, are we on track to spend the money? What's the schedule to perform the work?
I completely understand what you're saying, and at this point, I'm gonna have to defer to Public Works Director.
So one of the things I'd like to see is that there's a scheduled review of our capital program during the year. And whether it's at least quarter,
Okay.
that would be my preference. So I'll leave it to the members here to say, is there a schedule that we would like to review the capital program? I would like to see it at least quarterly.
I think 3 or 4 times a year, depending on the last quarter, the holiday, and then and audits and all that stuff. But yeah, I think it would be appreciated to have a little bit more of a specific dive into those.
Into each capital project. I think it's doable.
Mr. Perigo, do you thoughts?
Yeah,
Is that,
fine.
is that,
Sure.
all right, I think that's reasonable. John, anything else there? I guess we'll go to that.
No, I'm good. So if it's
Okay.
like March, June, September, early December,
Sure.
Just a deeper dive.
I think that's-
just to look at it and say,
Yep.
okay, here's where we are, here's what our program is. we intend to spend this amount of money in this period, we're gonna go out to bid on this.
Yep. It seems very easy.
So I'm interested in the material bids.
Not tennis court lighting?
You know, is it something that we're gonna get done in this? And I would like to think that.
And I, with good reason, am hesitant to give that a confident, I can just tell you that it has been budgeted. And it is in the 2023-2024 budget. It's been noted that
I would note that our neighbors at Shoreline, I just drove by there today. Very nice material on covers. Emulate what they've done. Actually. With that, even though we've changed our seating arrangement here, it's been our tradition to allow colleagues that have joined us to ask additional questions. 3 members of the council who are also here, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask of Director Vaughn or throw into the mix for discussion? No? Tova?
Well, I think that some of my questions probably get answered once we do that capital project deep dive, because the Beach Drive this station is another one of those things that I'm not quite sure why it keeps stretching out to the future. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you, everybody. John, did you get everything, all your questions answered? Okay. Can you flip over to,
so the back side of, just to give a brief overview, these are all the numbers. So that are populating the visual on the front side. So these are the actual numbers with the percentages, but where you're seeing on the front for the very easy to see green within and the yellow that have exceeded. So just to briefly identify all of the numbers on the back, and then the revenue by line item. These are the ones that we have broken out to just have a little bit of a deeper look at whether it was something that we were concerned about watching or something that was definitely doing well. So business tax landed right on the mark, 100%. And so that's that means we projected that one pretty darn on point, which is actually, I'm going to make note, is a little bit impressive through the 21-22 budget. So construction permits, they were came in a little bit lower. And that started in strong during the pandemic, and then it definitely with being able to get materials, being able to get contractors, etc., and do things that definitely kind of pivoted that item a little bit, because we were watching it because it was going crazy to start. Moving down to the gas tax, with the motor vehicle, that one was one that we were watching because everybody was working from home. And so, and that was changing with, and so we definitely had, and it did come in a little bit under what we had anticipated, but not too far under what we had anticipated. The mechanical and plumbing permits are merged together at 96%, came in quite well. Actually, pretty excited that passport revenue came in at 73%, which to start, we didn't have much activity on that until late 2021, and we have definitely changed that model. We do it by appointment only, but it has been very successful, and helped us streamline so that people are in, efficient, and out. And so that's a silver lining of something good that definitely came out of the pandemic for the city. The real estate excise tax 1 and 2, that did end up at And I will say that with the caveat that I think we budget amended that as an increase on the revenue side a couple times. So that wasn't an original budget number, but definitely continue to outpace what we had anticipated on a very conservative level. Sales and use tax, again, that too was over 100%. So we were able to estimate that at about the right amount. And then traffic safety camera revenue tickets, that is still continuing to come in a little bit on the stronger side of at 129%. That being said, there was some definitely one-time, what we defined as one-time revenue in and around that happened during this budget. So that being noted and identified on that amount. So that being said, are there any questions on the individual revenue by line items?
Sure, please.
Thank you. On the transportation capital revenue, is the difference between 5.7 and 2.9? If we didn't get grants?
It isn't that we didn't get grants, it's that we had grants budgeted that are based on a reimbursable basis. And so we have been quote unquote awarded the grant, but we have not received the funds because we have not expended the dollars. So it's on both sides. It's a revenue and an expenditure. It's a both sides.
So is that related to the roundabout?
Yes.
So when you look at the expenditures of 3.2 as budgeted, but we only expended roughly 400,000, and that's the difference between.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's a reimbursable style grant.
Yeah, so TIB, it's a TIB, and there's two grants in there, and there's also a WASDOT grant, and they are both based on reimbursable. So there's a couple big grants in there, and it was around that project.
Is there a sort of overall, we got it broken out, but an overall expenditure to revenue sort of totals? How did we do in the budget?
In
as a whole?
no, not on this report, but we can definitely. The city, from my overall review, has survived this last 2 years better than anticipated.
For sure, yeah, thank you.
But I will, as far as exact numbers go, we can definitely
I think it'd be
circle back.
nice to see at the mid-biennium and at the end, just kind of just a big high level snapshot of where did we end up.
So just to follow up on that, I was trying to do the math, but I'm not very good at public math. And
Talking math on TV.
so to follow on with Councilmember Riddles, it's just at the bottom, there would be totals.
We can,
Yeah.
And then somewhere there would be the reserve. So that you could look at it and say, we budgeted 43 million, we had expenditures of 42.9, and we had revenues of 44.1, and so and then we had reserve X and the last five years, therefore we're at here's our
It's a health check.
yep. We can look at, yes, we can look at it. We're, in fact, last year, I think when we started this, we were looking to improve the dashboard, and that is something that definitely hit the back burner. I'm just gonna admit that they're just.
But even to just showing totals, it's like my checkbook. If I don't actually do the math, I just record it. I don't know whether I had or behind. Now you can look at this and see what I had, which is good.
Yes.
I just wanted to go back to revenue by fund and kind of unfocus our eyes here for a second, Lindsay. and think about, you know, the health of the economy, kind of, see whether there's anything that you see here, not playing an economist on TV, but you know, seeing sewer utility fund revenue slightly down, street fund revenue slightly down, service water utility revenue slightly down, and transportation capital. Are we seeing things that people are sort of deferring?
I don't, I think
Anything
that,
that alarms you? That, I guess that's basically what I would, because we did have that a couple of years ago.
so I think that when you're budgeting on your revenue side at for utilities, if you're anywhere in the higher 90s, mid to high 90s, you've done well.
Okay.
You're never going to capture it possibly perfectly. But that goes to both sides. If we were over a little bit, because you're going to be there, there's always going to be the handful of accounts that you have that are in, you know, in the rears. And then eventually, as those houses turn over,
You'll get caught up.
the liens before they can be sold, are paid. And so you're going to get little buckets of money occasionally, and you're gonna have certain, you know, that aren't quite paying. But it's really, what this is telling you is that's really a very small percentage for the city as a
Yeah.
whole, for utilities, for the sewer and the surface water. And the street fund revenue, the street fund is just one that I think every entity kind of struggles with. I don't think that is unique to Lake Forest Park. I think we've had a lot of discussions around its right of ways and gas tax, and there's just not a ton of revenue that actually does go into that. But that's one that I think every place I have ever worked, I have watched that fund on the revenue and the expenditure side closely. That's not unique to Lake Forest Park.
Great, thank you.
Sort of a follow-up, for, like you say, for the utility revenue. I'm assuming we take into consideration in our projection of revenue that some homes may not be caught up. Or do we assume just? So I'm wondering if this is including an assumption that some folks are not caught up, and then there are even more that we're struggling. Or if this is a reflection of we're not perfect.
So we try to, and I think in this last budget, we have built, since I've been here, the two budgets that we've put together, we have built what we define our, well, basically estimating calculators based off of what we have and what we think we're going to receive for each year. And so we have tried to become more accurate with those tools. That being said, you can make yourself crazy thinking about all of the details of what people may or may not do. So we build these and we take those numbers and then we try, and there are some people that will, you know, have an older account that they will pay that, you know, was a couple $1,000s in the rears, and then that's receipted in this revenue. And then you have some that aren't paying. And the way that I have talked about it with numerous finance directors is they just kind of let that wash itself, where you get the extras and then you have some people that don't. But if you just try to estimate what you think you will receive in that portion and call it good, and don't try to make yourself crazy with all the what ifs, and then pay attention to how you're ending up with those calculators. When you build those calculators, are you ending up at, you know, 95, 97? And if you are, you've done well, you know, so
So this being slightly under is not an indicator of unique concerns in our community that more people are struggling
I
to
would-
pay this. It's just within the standard deviation of where we expected it
Correct.
to be.
That
Okay.
that is an excellent way to put it.
Thank you.
Thoughts, colleagues from anybody else? Thoughts? Okay, thank you, Director Hahn. Are we all in a good place relative to the director's board and the budget monitoring dashboard? Okay, we'll move on. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And now we're going to walk into some old business for the council members that have definitely been around since the fall of 2019. And some actually probably old news for old business for every single council member that's been here at this point, but really old news for the council members that have been here since the fall of 2019 when we started this whole process. And I'm buying Matt some time to pull up the perfect. So this is probably one of the most exciting things that finance can do for a city, which exciting and finance are two words that maybe don't always go together.
It's
But
oxymoronic, yeah.
But it is exciting and it is one of probably something that I definitely enjoy discussing. And so I'm excited to bring this forward again this evening. And it's talking about the investment strategy for the policy that we did revise back in 2019. And that policy is the comprehensive financial management policy. And that can be found in your budget. We do include it in the main budget every single year. And that was revised and adopted in actually almost exactly a couple of years ago. So February 13th of 2020. And right after, when we were walking into March to have this discussion about how to diversify and walk into purchasing bonds, the pandemic hit. And we picked up the reins and we just put a halt to all of it. Because we didn't know what that really meant for the city. So therefore, it all just hit a stopping point. So with that, then we brought it back up as part of the retreat, last year's retreat, and then walking into that, that within the policy is the authorization for investments types for diversification. The city currently has all of its funds within the first two being the Washington State Local Government Investment Pool, which is where the majority of the funds are, and then the city's designated bank. And what I'm hoping to have the conversation around this evening is walking into what it looks like to enter into the government agency bonds, which we have currently in our policy that it's maxed out at 60% with a target of 50%. And the highlight is that there is a not to exceed in there of a 5-year maturity date. That being said, there is a healthy balance between short and longer term investments, period. The city needs both. So going to the next slide, this is where the numbers come in. This is where the government agency bonds, and these are just, keep in mind, these are rough numbers, and the concept I'm going to walk you through each year, the maturity dates of the year and a half, and the year that goes, that would be estimated from this point in time. The yield, which would be the interest rate, the investment amount. So I have them all at about $1 million, and this has been a best practice from my past, and I have watched this model of about $1 million-ish work well. And then I tried to build a table of what it looks like visually, so that if we invest 1 year, what that looks like versus investing out all the way to 5 years. I did do a break right after 3 years to 3.5 years, just to visually have a little bit of a break in this table. And to also kind of walk into the next conversation of definitely having some options. And options being, because it is stated in the investment policy that the Budget and Finance Committee has to approve the strategy. And then it is the designated, which is myself, the finance director, and if for any reason I was unable to make decisions, the next person in line to do it would be the city administrator. So those are the two positions, because everything we do has to have a backup position to making decisions. So that being said, the yield, you will quickly notice that the yield is inverted. So as you go out 5 years, normally it's the opposite. Normally, if you're going out and you're investing funds for 5 years, the interest rates go up. But that's clearly not the case in what's being presented here. That being stated, what this is saying as a bigger picture on what economists are estimating is that the economy is moving towards a recession. I don't know how to politely say that, but I guess there's no real polite way to say that that's what economists think, but that's what an inverted yield curve is saying. So 1 year out, you currently right now with the LGIP and the bank's interest rate, they're right between 4.3 and 4.45-ish%. That being said, if a recession hits in 3 months, that rate could dwindle to a lot less quickly.
Back to where we were in 2020.
Yes, it
What
could be point, it's when I
What was-
started, I think
It was point.
it was point like 0.13%.
Yeah, we were losing money.
0.
We were losing money. It
0
was-
point, I
Cost
mean,
us money. Yeah,
it can be,
Yeah.
the
that's right.
the liquid interest rate, and when I say liquid, I'm sorry, I'm referring to the shorter term, the shorter term, just for everybody's benefit. The liquid is the shorter term investments which would be the LGIP and the bank's interest rate, because those can change quickly tomorrow. When you diversify and you walk into the government agency bonds, what you're purchasing here is a guaranteed interest rate. So you're purchasing it, and when we make these purchases, as from a financial standpoint, this is very welcoming and exciting for me to budget, because I know for a fact that the city will receive X amount of dollars on this portion of its invested money for, the next budget. So it really does help create some financial stability on knowledge, on being able to estimate on the interest rate. And the other thing I didn't mention is that doing these kind of investments is the only thing that finance can do that increases the revenue in every single fund the city has, which outside of this, I can't think of anything else that affects every single fund to increase its revenue. So it has that benefit. That being said, I don't think I quite mentioned yet that the city's cash flow at the end of January 2023 is about 27 million. So that being said, I still think that it is in the city's best interest to start small and look at how this works, see how it works, and then we walk into going towards back to the previous slides, our target of 50%. The other thing is you have to know your cash flow and your city's needs and what's upcoming. So we know that we've got some bigger projects coming up and there might be more dollars, you know, so we want to be a little more careful. I think recommending to invest somewhere around $5 million, so it would be 5 groups of about $1 million, is a very safe number to start walking into, which is very much so significantly under what our targeted amount would be, just so we can watch how it works. Are there any questions? And
Let me just suggest that, just for the edification of our colleagues that were not necessarily here in 2020, several things that have happened in the past. One of the things was our history we've been extremely conservative in terms of where we put our money, including which banks we put it in, etc. We moved a number of years ago. Was it before you, Lindsay, when we shifted banks, or was it right when you started?
it was before.
Yeah.
It was before me.
And that was a big deal because it was tens of thousands of dollars in fees that we were paying out unnecessarily. And that was the beginning of moving in a direction of sort of, I want to say progressive, but more forward-thinking investments and allocations of where our monies were residing. And not for some of you folks not having the benefit of the presentation that we were given in 2020, I can't believe that's been 3 years ago now. That previously, as Director Vaughn indicated, we were in some of our investments, we were receiving 10%. It was, I mean, it was really at the low point. I think maybe that's a little low, but and quite ridiculous. We're going backwards in terms of our monies. And so, having said that, I think that if we need to do a little bit of a I wouldn't say catch up, but a little bit more of a primer session on some of the reasons for doing these kinds of investments, we certainly can bookmark that for another day if there's any interest, colleagues. Thoughts, anyone? Is there? Start with Councilmember Furtani.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to find out, will any of these macroeconomic events like the debt ceiling possibly not being played around with affect any of the payouts we would get if we would invest in these government agency bonds?
I have not had any other outside economic factor play into not receiving yield amounts in a government agency bond previously. So that's probably the extent of my, and I can tell you that this is probably one of the safest things we can do. We would not invest in anything. A government agency bond is a very safe form of diversifying the investment. And we're one of the only cities left remaining, I think, next to Briar, is maybe the only other city in this immediate area even that is not currently using this form of investing.
No, and I agree. And the fact that I even have to ask that question is sort of embarrassing. But the fact is that there are some events that may occur that even if we get delayed 3 months on the payout or something like that, it could have serious consequences for us. So I just wanted to make sure that that was okay.
And that is actually a question I can circle back and ask more questions on. Circle back with.
I think Vice Chair Castle was next.
Couple questions. Are you able to shorter than a year, or is the year the minimum amount?
That is a great question. I don't know if they do 6 months. 6 or 8 months or somewhere in between, less than a year.
Yeah, I just was curious about that, because it'd be interesting to see what the interest rate would be on that. And then the other question, just really for, to remind me, but also I'm sure even for our newer colleagues. The 5 million that you would take to invest, is that money that is part of the current budget money, or is it our reserves? Where is the money coming from?
It's cash flow, yes, so it's, I'm gonna turn around, not
Yeah, that's
meaning
fine.
to turn my back to you, but I feel a little odd. So it's cash flow, so what that means is, it is reserved money in multiple funds, and when I say that the city has a cash flow of that level of money, I'm talking across every fund the city has. I am not talking about one fund, I'm talking about bank accounts, so there's the fund accounting, and so it is, when I speak about investing, this amount of money, it is more of the reserves that you're not really trying to use and tap into. That's the money that you want to be able to let it work for you and let your money make money.
And so my question about 6 months was, at the beginning of a biennium, if you have money that you won't actually need to spend, until year 2 of the biennium, if you could invest it in 6 months, that it would work for you. That's why I asked the
So
question.
eventually we will walk into and hopefully have out 5 years. The ultimate goal is to have a model similar to what's being presented to you right here. And eventually, I think this is the full picture of what I'd like to see in government agency bonds, and it's the year, every 6 months, something's maturing. So therefore, your cash flow is set up to where if the liquid, if you don't feel like it's the best choice to reinvest that money, then every 6 months you have something maturing and you can make that decision dependent on your cash flow. So that's the beauty of taking this every 6 month model and having something mature continuously, so that you can, and when it matures, if you don't need to, you just put it on the back end and you go out to whatever the committee decides is the best practice for the city to start, the best strategy. And then we go from there.
Just on point really quickly before we get to Mr. Goldman, this concept of laddering is something that we as a policy making body really felt, as and Director Vaughn has felt too, that it's essential for us to have this, the liquidity, if you will, on a semi-regular basis, and the ability to roll things over. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that we didn't really talk about the previous investment strategy, just for the edification of our friends here. The LGIP, could you just talk about that a little bit? The very low yield.
Well, it's
Very conservative.
currently, yes, it's very safe, it's very conservative, and it's very liquid. I could, if the city needed more money to expend for one reason or another, we can have it in our bank accounts for use tomorrow. So it's in an account that is within our name, but that's what we define as it being incredibly liquid. You can pivot on that very quickly, and that definitely has its place. It's something that I think almost every agency in government uses, is the local government investment pool, and it's a combined pool where everybody puts their money, and but it's very conservative and it is very liquid, and the rate can change very quickly. In fact, I think this is one of the highest rates I've actually seen during the course of my time in government, is at 4%. This is one of the highest liquid rates I've actually from that level of money. And I think stop there? Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think just checking with everyone else. Does anybody have any questions about LGAP or any of those other things? Okay. So, I mean, again, going back 20, 30 years, this community has been extraordinarily conservative in terms of their investment policies. And I think that as a group, we have slowly kind of tiptoed into considering diversification and looking at different methodologies for, particularly when we were seeing numbers where we were literally our investments were going down in value because of inflationary pressures, and that is a very unhappy place to be. And so trying to find ways to make sure that we're starting to at least stay par is, I think, is really critical. Mr. Goldman, you've been very patient.
Yeah, first comment, I'm totally on board with this. I put my money where my mouth is because Dr. Khan convinced me to convince my homeowners association to adopt this strategy with our repair funds. We established that last November, was 3 weeks ago. So I'm totally on board. It's just a matter of figuring out the right amounts. My question, can you explain kind of the distinction between a government agency bond versus a treasury bill?
So this is where I know enough to know that the government agency bonds are incredibly safe, and I will work with somebody that is very well versed in them. Treasury bills, when it gets into all of the different kinds of investments, this is not 100% my expertise, and I will just own that. But treasury bills and whatnot, I know other governments that have used them. I don't know a ton about them. And so I want to be careful stating the differences because that it's just not 100% my area of expertise.
The reason I ask is that's what our HOA was looking at as an option, that and bond and bank CDs. My understanding, and feel free to correct me or do some research and correct me if I'm wrong, is that treasuries still have the same safety, the same full faith and credit of the United States. And when I've been looking, I think their rates are slightly higher than these. So I wonder if that might be an option with equal safety, but slightly higher returns.
Well, I will say that it is not in our investment policy, and we can't do anything outside of the actual adopted policy, which was the start of the conversation in 2019 to change the policy to add this, because prior to changing the policy, we couldn't walk into even having the conversation until the policy allowed it. And I do know, in fact, actually, we were just having this conversation as we just have a new employee that's starting today in finance, which we're really excited about. And as things shift, and possibly as my accounting supervisor and I have more time, investments is one area that I would love to learn more about, and same with her. I know she also definitely has a lot of contacts in government, and I think it's an area that we could explore to learn and potentially do greater things for the city. I'm just gonna own that I don't have an expertise on that, but I do know that other government agencies do allow those in their policies, which tells me they're very safe, because and that they are very a credible form of investment.
Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that from the standpoint of, so Councilmember Fertani's question about these types of bonds, in the case of us not getting paid, it would be a default basically. And the chances of that happening from one of these different investment instruments is, it's not, I would not say it's non-existent, but it's certainly very unlikely unless there's a catastrophic economic collapse. I think Councilmember Goldman's question about treasury notes, I think is a good one. It takes more, as Director Vaughn indicated, that was not since when we talked about this a number of years ago, we were sort of taking baby steps to be simplistic. Largely because the community, and we heard from a number of members of the community saying, be very cautious about diversification of portfolio. And stepping outside of just the local investment pool that historically all the cities had participated in. And so it's baby steps here. I'll leave it there.
I'll add one additional piece of information. When we say that a lot of other entities, government entities invest in this manner, I mean, our immediate neighbors, Kenmore, Shoreline, Mount Lake Terrace, Mukilteo, Edmonds, Monroe, Linwood, Medina, Renton, Issaquah, Duval, Mill Creek, Everett, Snohomish, Auburn, Federal Way, Des Moines. Just to give a quick rundown of cities right here that are using this exact same form of investments to tell you how safe it is. And I'll just.
Director Bonnie, it occurs to me, I'm trying to remember back to the presentation. We had multiple presentations over a period of time. I wonder if there's one of those presentations that is sort of summarizes sort of the nutshell of what we were thinking at that time, that maybe we could forward on to our colleagues. I'll see if I can take a look as well, but there are definitely several PowerPoint presentations that were provided to us on a number of occasions where we were able to ask questions and think about it. But it might be helpful just to get that foundational knowledge so everybody can understand where some of us are coming from that have participated in those discussions before.
And I think this is the start to bigger conversations in the future of possibly exactly what you were asking. Maybe a better understanding of government investments. But this is definitely step one. I would say this is a great step one outside of just so you have a couple of diversifications. And then going into the US Treasury, doing some other to fully understand, really diversifying into multiple things and seeing how it works for your government agency. That kind of research truly excites me. And I know that I think that you have a finance team, that this is the kind of stuff that we find. I mean, we have to do our regular jobs and keep the wheels on the bus and keep everything going forward. But this is the kind of stuff that we define in our world as fun. So.
I'm just gonna get up and buy one for weeks.
Director, just so one, if we were to look at that 5 million as our starting, and we said our policy is targeting 50%. This is not 50%, the 5 million. What is the number that that 50% would be based on? Is it the 27
Yes.
million? Okay.
So yes, and that being said, that actually isn't my recommendation coming to today.
Oh, I just
To
kind of
ask-
there were.
Truthfully, it's to start small, so we can see how it works. And I mean, maybe by the time we are 3 or 5 years out, we're already on to looking at other options of diversifying even further. And look what that might look like for the city, truthfully.
Sure.
But I want to be careful saying that because I say the things like that and I tend to overextend myself. Be very good at that.
So Director Vaughn, what are you looking for a decision, a recommendation from us tonight?
So what I'm hoping for, yes, is that in the policy, it does specifically state that the Budget and Finance Committee has to agree upon the strategy that is then implemented by the finance director. So I kind of have come to you with basically either one of two simple asks this evening. My recommendation is to try to stick to this about 5 million in $1 million blocks. So therefore we'd be making 5 investments. And then asking you what you're comfortable with. Are you comfortable trying to do the 1.5 to 3 years and doing the first 3, going out only 3 years to see how it works? Or are you more comfortable or wanting to lean more towards the possibly starting in $1 million blocks? Again, the same dollar-ish amount of about 5 million, and do it every single year. So we would invest out per the policy out to 5 years of a maturity date. So it would be the same amount, but it would be the difference of locking in year 1 to 3 years out and just staying very short. And then assessing from there, and when this comes due in a year, making the decisions to what to do next. Or we can take the option 2, I'm trying to keep this very simple, 1 or 2, of just then doing it every single year. And like the value different on interest would be just over 389 if we kept it short to the 3 years. And if we did every single year and we went out to 5 years, that investment value would be about 601,000. And it's just at this point, it's a comfort level. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer in any way, shape, or form. I just think that the big win is that we start implementing what we've been talking about for a while with this dollar.
Mr. Lebo.
So thank you. I'm very comfortable with the idea of doing it, but I'm not ready this evening to say proceed with this option or strategy. And what I would like to see is a better understanding for myself of what we are referring to as government agency bonds. What is a government agency bond? Because there are lots of different government agencies that sell bonds. So I'm very interested in understanding what is your interpretation of this strategy of what is a government agency bond. The other is I would be curious to understand what our neighbors are doing, such as Shoreline, Bellevue, Kirkland, in terms of how they approach this, what they see as their reserves, their cash flow, and how they ladder their investments on this, to see if there is a pattern amongst our neighbors of what they're doing. The other is it possible to show us a graph, for example, that shows in a stacked bar chart of this is what we would propose that says, here's the amount that we have in our local government investment pool, here's what we have in our bank, and then you stack on top of it, if we're buying $5 million worth of government agency bonds, the maturity of those are 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. So that within this period of your reserve, you look at it and say, here's how much I've got invested in each one as a percentage. And then that translates into a liquidity, because there's certain things, if it's 5 years out, you don't have access to it for 5 years. The other is, can you overlay it with what your cash flow is? So if you have $27 million, but your cash flow is such that your expenditures, you just drew a line through those 5 years or whatever period you selected to have the stacked bars, what would it look like? Because you never want to be in a situation where your immediate cash flow requirements are greater than your available funds. And so what are the relative standards to say that I only want to be within 25% of my 1 year, 50% of my 1 year, or whatever it is. And then can you back model it, meaning what would have happened over the last 5 years if you have done this? So because you have the history. Well, we know how much we spent over the last 5 years.
And how much we lost, yeah.
It's the same thing, because, if government bonds include municipal bonds, which I don't know, but there's a very different level of security associated with different government bonds. We all know the history of the Washington public powers.
Well, I misunderstand you. You would have made a lot of money.
No, I understand that. No, I get that. If you invest and you have positive returns, you may have.
Yeah.
So because part of my question is, if everyone else is investing 33% of their available reserves based on cash flow, why start out at 25%? If you back model it and say, well, we're still well within what we would see as our needed cash flow based upon what we think is a reasonable level. Is 1 year and 5 million, 2 years at another, whatever it is. Sometimes it's, well, why wait to make an investment? It's the old adage, when is the best time to plant a tree? Well,
20
When
years
you
ago.
have seeds.
the best time to plant a tree is today, because if you wait, then you have a broken tree. So, investments are like growing a tree. If you don't plant it, you don't reap the benefits of the tree. And if you only plant small trees, when you really need and could plant larger trees, why wait? So I'm not sure that starting small generates any more confidence. What would generate confidence is what are our neighbors doing? What are government agency laws? What would be our model for attachment? Because our neighbors must do this already. And if they're not, they should. And I'm a strong believer of copying good practices.
Yeah, and I am.
Because there are cities that have invested in municipal bonds, which have high rates of returns at various times in history. But when you really got down to what were the backing of those municipal bonds, which are government bonds, they were not well backed. Which isn't to say this isn't a good investment, which I believe it is. And so I don't know that starting small provides any confidence. Rather, what is it that we're doing? That, to me, that is what the confidence is.
So I'm currently trying to quickly look back to the presentation that Peter Becker did in the fall of 2019. If I can get you your quick answer on government agency bonds.
So if you just want to send me Peter's,
Yeah, I was thinking, that was one of the
Yeah.
presentations I was thinking was useful.
but I am interested in what our neighbors are. Because
There, and the other thing that I'm quickly finding in here is there's some key difference between government agency bonds and the LGIP as investments for public
Yep.
funds. And basically, to safety, government agency bonds have never defaulted. Backed by Treasury or its agencies, 20 to 50% of LGIP is composed of agencies. So, in fact, when you're investing in the LGIP, it sounds like you're partially already investing in government agency bonds through their diversification. Liquidity, no early termination penalty active. And then yield generally higher than the LGIP. Well, that's it is in the short term, but then the further you go out, it definitely applies to the yield curve. So yeah, I guess so maybe we do need to just have Peter come in at another meeting.
I think that would be fine, but I would be interested in what our neighbors are doing and whether they already have models. Because I am a believer that investing such as planting trees reap the greatest benefits if you plant the trees that you can afford to plant.
And-
in that time frame that you wish to have reaped your
Sure.
investment from.
And I
rather than
understand,
just Planting some shrubs.
My suggestion is, and Johnny makes some excellent points. I think that, again, the foundational knowledge that brings everybody's comfort levels with the place where we need to be. I think it's very reasonable to consider what our neighbors are doing and see what we can find in that regard. I have a little hesitation about sort of trying to do the look back. That's pretty compared to rates of return, and that might be a little bit more modeling wise than.
What I'm interested in is, for example, if you have your stacked bond, if you have your stacked bar chart that shows the amount, the percentage of your investments and the liquidity of those, and then you run through that, your cash flow And then you put in there what are sort of your minimum maximums that you would want to have with regard to liquidity, so you can contain
I see.
your cash flow. Because if your liquidity is 80% in 1 year, and yet that represents $20 million, but your cash flow needs are only represented at 5 years, or $5 million at any one period. You've got more liquidity.
Just sitting there,
it's
yeah.
Just sitting there.
Yeah.
But if your cash flow is $10 million, I'm not sure you would want to have liquidity that's 12 years, because that's too close to.
I see. So you're talking a little bit, not a steep dive. Okay, Mr. Goldman, you there?
I think what might help to assuage some people's concerns, what's the emergency hatch? So for instance, if you own a bank CD, you can break it at a 3-month interest penalty. If you have a treasury note, you can sell it on the secondary market. So if the city had an emergency for cash, what could we do?
What's the ejector here?
And that's what I'm 100% advising, is just to start. I do understand what you're saying, but that's why the recommendation is to basically, the city has never come close to getting down to this. This is the reserve money that normally the city doesn't really touch. So that's the money I'm talking about, allowing it to make some more money for you on a very small amount. Keeping in mind our circumstances, we do have some larger expenses coming up, bigger projects. Keeping that on the forefront and making sure that we're playing it extremely safe. But here on the next part of breaking it, it says no early termination penalty. Active secondary market determines the sale price based on the current interest rate. So technically you can break a government agency bond and call it. You don't necessarily lose the money. You might not get back the interest rate that you had anticipated receiving, but so you can, but I just have to say as a blanket statement, I would, as your finance director, would not recommend that you even come close to putting yourself in that situation where we're breaking how we invested longer term funds. And it period. I don't know. There's no real gray area on this for me. I would rather hold much more in liquid to immediately have the cash flow in an emergency versus overextend because we got excited about what government agency bonds can bring in on a little bit higher of an interest for a yield rate without seeing the bigger picture of needs for the city. I would never, as the director, recommend getting too excited about one thing. There is a very big reason why we diversify on portfolio investments, because we need both.
Mr. Hill had a thought, I think.
So since we are going to be coming back, so I think some questions here, it will be beneficial. And I think council members, they were saying that it deserves some exploration, and the fact that is that 5 million that you targeted truly stuff that we never touch, or and that's why you're recommending 5 million, or is it slightly bigger that we never touch? Maybe that cash flow exercise can tell us that if it's 5 million, it's 5 million.
Sure.
I think it would help us to understand what that true cash flow is. And it may be very difficult to figure that out, but I think we should at least try and explore it and have an understanding. And it's 5 million, that's fine, but I'm trying to figure out what that. It's just like I'm saying, getting a home, what's the least amount you're comfortable with in your savings account? You take some out of it for a CD for
That's really the point. It's not whether we think of 5 million small or large. It's really about
What's the right number?
what is the right number. It's really based upon your cash flow, and what you see as the money that you don't touch. Because if you have a cash flow of $10 million a month, whether you may not want to have only liquidity of $12 million. But if your cash flow is $5 million, I'm not sure you want to have liquidity of 25. Because then you're not using your money. I mean, we all have checking accounts, which checking accounts don't pay anything. But we don't put our retirements into our checking accounts. And so we make the judgment that, oh, how much money I want in the checking account versus how much I want in the retirement account or my vacation account. If I'm only taking 1 year vacation, then I may be comfortable having money stashed in 1 year CD. So every time the CD rolls over, I go on vacation. So it's not $5 million. It's really about what is the right percentage of what we're carrying based upon the cash flow.
Right.
Some
And
of us sleep better at night with larger checking balance.
And then I think also looking into that 6 month, 9 month option to get us started with some interest bearing more quickly if possible. And just to clarify, because I understand it, having these 1 year, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, but that's the way we go into that sort of bracketing. After 1 year, you get your interest yield in your bank account, and you've got that $1 million, and you can roll it back into a 1 or a 2 or 3 year bond and just keep reinvesting the principal as long as the cash flow analysis proves that we can still have that money held here. And then we can not, I mean, that's the other thing, is we know we've got a project coming up in year 4, so we're not going to reinvest a couple of these in that year 4 because we need that additional cash flow.
More of a buffer on the cash. flow.
Exactly, yeah, so that we don't end up dipping into reserves because we have money tied up here. And so I think in addition to the looking back and kind of getting a sense of where we've been, I think getting more aware of where we are going in the future and where we really are going to have capital projects that are going to be high expenditure on our end. Obviously, a lot of our stuff's grant based, so, but knowing kind of out where might we be tweaking this in order to bring in more liquidity due to these bigger projects. So I think we're going to have to get pretty tied into our projections as well as taking a look at the history. Just so that we have some comfort level, knowing what we can take out when and what that does to our overall balance.
All good thoughts. I think there's a couple of things we can certainly work with the administration to bring back for future discussion in the short term. And I do appreciate Director Vaughn, your appeal for simplicity, if you will. Appeal is not the right word, but starting with a number that seems reasonable and responsible rather than going too low or too high, starting sort of in the middle. But I appreciate Mr. Limbo's questions about let's make sure we're not going too far in. And I'm not suggesting that you're really saying that, but 2, we may be leaving some money on the table from a couple of standpoints. So we certainly can. My suggestion, colleagues, is that I can sit down with Director Vaughn and the administration, talk about a couple of these ideas and see what kind of things we can bring back very simply to everyone, as well as a little bit of background information. And if you have other thoughts too, that you would like things that could be in a reasonable time frame be brought back to the group, then speaking of money on the table, because the longer we delay this, we've delayed this 3 years now, although the yield's been abysmally low up until recently. The longer we delay this, I'd rather get this established and then revisit it in 6 months or so to maybe an additional push into the mix, depending on where we decide as a group. Yeah.
So very much thank you for the presentation. And you started out very excited about the financial
Yeah.
investments, and I totally get that. And I'm very much excited about it. I like to see the models because I like to plant as large trees as we can and not leave them.
There you go.
It's just,
We like our tree analogy.
And so that's why, what do our neighbors do? if their apple trees are growing well and they've been growing for 10 years, then that's probably a good variety of plant.
It's just, I've done this model at another city and I over tripled their interest and made it stable and all their funds, and it's so, I've watched it work into, so I get a little probably too excited about it.
You've been very
That's
patient for
okay.
many years.
Colleagues, other questions on the investment policy? Well, so we'll bring this back. Investment policy considerations, we'll bring it back. Budget and finance here next month. Vice Chair Casper.
Way to move.
Well, I was thinking about that. We could also, beginning of, I have to look at the calendar. March is shaping up to be.
It's got to be done.
Yeah,
Yes, I think we're gonna need.
okay,
I don't know.
That was really my question. Needed my question.
okay, fair enough. Yeah, because time wise, I'm not sure too whether there's gonna be enough room in the schedule to make it.
Let's see.
Possibly. Any other thoughts, folks, on this investment strategy? One of the things I did want to bookmark for future conversations, just to let everybody know, there's been, we touched on this previously. Want to bookmark the policy discussion related to tree fees, fines, etc. Just so that we can get a little bit more clarity on that. That's really more discussion amongst ourselves about making sure that we have sort of a policy set in place that says we'd like to see these monies go into this place. And there are some specific, not without going into the weeds here, there are some specific restrictions about how we can what's the right word? Direct those funds, reserve those, not reserve. What's the correct word, Director Vaughn?
Use of the funds.
Yeah, it's not about the use of the fund, it's actually about the accounting, so I'm trying to think of the word, but I'll think of it later. So we just have to be cautious in making sure that we have on a policy side, have clarity there, and then and be able to give the administration, reinforce the administration's expectations about the policy and what our expectations are as well. Because we've got a lot of questions from the public on that. Is there anything else for the good of the order today? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Director Vaughn. I'm sorry, citizen comments, my apologies. Or is there no new business? Matt, do we have any citizens? Okay,
Just double check. Sorry.
no, that's good, thank you. I'm very famous for forgetting the last item on the agenda, so appreciate that. And with that, we're adjourned, people. Thank you. My voice is gone. Good time.